Hi, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of Forum Europe Cybersecurity Salons. This is a series of panel debates organised around the annual Security Summit, which is usually held in Brussels, but like so much in the world right now, is going to take place online. The salons will run between October and December and aim to complement the main event by giving us space for a broader, more nuanced discussion of the big strategic questions in the cybersecurity sector. It's time to take a bit of space to think. If you think of the main summit as a newspaper with the op-ed, the analysis, and the opinion pieces that kind of bring the news to life, we're going to be hearing from people in the academic and think tank worlds, alongside policymakers and other stakeholders. This is the first session, so welcome to you all. The session is public, so don't hesitate to tweet using the hashtags and things, which you can see below flying along there. And if you're not registered for the Security Summit, there's still virtual space to do so. So go to eusecuritysummit.com and you can sign up there. My name's Frances Robinson. I'm a freelance journalist and moderator, and I'm coming to you from a slightly makeshift studio here at my parents' house. The window's getting fixed in my house, and so people can say sometimes the panel format is a little bit lacking in suspense. Well, I'm going to warn you, at any moment this curtain behind me could fall down, so that should bring things to life for you. Please be patient. Right, let's get down to business. Long-standing trade relationships between Europe, China, and the US are in the middle of a fundamental upheaval. I feel that certainly in my lifetime, things have never been less stable. Global technology firms are at the heart of this shake-up because digital infrastructure is absolutely essential to modern economies, a point the pandemic has hammered home to us all. This political environment is having a very real impact on trade. The USA's recently announced Clean Network Programme, there's the EU's slightly softer digital sovereignty approach, and China has long been facing calls to further open its market to foreign businesses and investment. What's the digital economy going to look like? Will we have a bunch of divergent rules worldwide? Will people hammer out some kind of compromise? How are things going to develop? We've got a great panel here today to discuss things, and we'll start by setting the scene with some opening remarks from David O'Sullivan. I'm sure you all know David. He's a senior counsellor at law firm Steptoe, a former EU ambassador to the USA, and a resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund. So what he doesn't know about this field can be written, or rather engraved, on the back of a teeny tiny microchip. David, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Frances. And I've only got a few minutes to just give some opening and framing remarks. So let me just pick up on 4 points which I think are important in this context. The first you've already touched on, is just the increasing essential nature of the internet in our daily lives, going from the days when we use it for emails to these kind of conferences, but with the Internet of Things coming at us, where everything is going to be interconnected. 5G, you're going to have autonomous vehicles. There have really emerged very serious national security concerns about the internet, who owns it, who controls it. And I think many of these questions are perfectly legitimate about critical infrastructure, power stations, air traffic control, and so forth, concerns about non-state actors intervening in that space, but also concerns about hostile state interventions. And we know that the great powers, particularly the US and China, are regularly testing and probing their respective cyber defenses. And most people believe that if there ever were to be a conflict, an initial cyber attack would probably be the start of it. So national security is a really big issue. I think it can be abused. I think the Trump administration is over-interpreting a national security dimension. But this is a legitimate issue, and we're going to have to figure out how to manage that in the future. The second point I wanted to mention is, of course, the info wars, the information wars, the use of the internet, the increasing fact that people get their information from the internet and increasingly less from the traditional media, the fact that we now realize how this can be manipulated, how this can be abused. How do you regulate that? In Europe, there is much more of a tendency to want to regulate issues like hate speech or disinformation, less taste for it in the US with, of course, the amendment rights of free speech. And this, again, is an area where I think there is going to be scope for conflict and disagreement, but which will continue to be a major part of the debate. The third point I wanted to pick up on is, of course, the antitrust or the dominant position issue, the fact that the internet space is dominated by a handful of very, very powerful and large companies who not only make large sums of money, but also there can be a feeling that these companies who would claim that, of course, they've grown, and they have grown through innovation, through entrepreneurial spirit, but there is a sense that they may be using their position to stifle innovation and to make it more difficult for new entrants to get into the market. And so do we really have a thriving free market of the internet, or is there a risk of the excessive dominance of these companies? And you saw that in the United States, in the Congress, a big paper was produced raising some of these issues. Europe has long been trying to deal with these issues, going back to the days of Microsoft, but more recently with Margrethe Vestager, some controversial cases, some controversial court judgments on the issue, not always supportive of the positions taken by the Commission as the antitrust regulator. And this, of course, also covers the issue of taxation and whether internet companies pay their fair share of taxation, something that we've been trying to deal with in the OECD, but not with great success. The final and fourth point I just want to make is all of this is really about the degree of regulation and state intervention in the internet. In its early days, I think everyone saw it, and I certainly did, as slightly anarchic. It would escape. It was a kind of space where all kinds of good and interesting things could go on, and it couldn't be controlled and run by governments. I'm afraid, those optimistic days are long gone. China has demonstrated that you effectively can control the internet in a geographic space, and we've seen many abuses of the internet, and that it's not always been a force for good, quite the contrary. But what is the balance, therefore, between regulation and freedom and innovation? And more importantly, and this is my final point, is that regulation going to be regionalized? So are we going to have a US internet space, an EU internet space, a China internet space? And how do we avoid this sort of balkanization of the internet? And the only way, it seems to me, that you can do that would be to have more broadly based international agreements. For example, take the issue of data privacy, which is very controversial with the GDPR. The United States thinking of bringing in its own rules. California already has a set of rules. The ideal solution would be to have some internationally agreed principles about how you manage data privacy and people's data. But this is hugely challenging in a world where multilateralism seems to be losing some of its momentum. But in the end, I think if we are to avoid this fragmentation of the internet, which I think would be a great pity, we need to start talking more seriously about greater international consensus on how to manage some of these difficult issues. So more questions there than answers, I'm afraid, Francis, but I hope that provides a brief framing of what I hope will be a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, David. That's extremely helpful. And yes, I think questions are much more use than answers at this stage in the discussion and the whole Cyber Salons process. So with this so neatly framed, we should move on to the panel. I'm going to ask each of the members to make 5 minutes of introductory remarks, and no more than 5 minutes. I've got a clock ticking up here. I've got a clock ticking down there. I can see exactly how long you're all taking. They should appear as I introduce them. So we'll bounce a few questions around, and don't worry, questions from the floor are still very much a part of the process. We're using Slido. You should be able to see a widget. So do ping your questions in, and they'll get sent to me by the team. Great. So we're going to hear from Julian Nossetti, who's an Associate Fellow at IFRI, Professor and Chair of Cyber Risk Governance at the Rennes School of Business. We've got Kieran Desai, who's EU Competition Law Leader at EY in Brussels. Konstantinos Komiatis is Senior Director of Policy Development and Strategy at the Internet Society. Wei-Nian Hu is a Research Fellow at CEPS, Brussels think tank, I'm sure you know their work. And Shen Yi is an associate professor at Fudan University, and his research focuses on cybersecurity, cyber diplomacy, and the governance of global cyberspace. So all stuff that David was mentioning there, and all stuff that we can go into in more depth. So I guess I should ask Julianne to kick us off. Please go for it.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you so much for inviting me to this session this morning. And actually, this global outlook on tech and digital economy is fascinating because this is actually a deep dive into the backbone of today's world politics. And let's only think about TikTok, for example. There's much more at stake than a simple app for teenagers, of course. And instead, we live in a sort of apps. In an age, for apps wars between nations that have clear geopolitical and geotechnological fallout. Well, I've not thought to focus my talk on TikTok, of course, I will show you. And like Ambassador Sullivan, I will try to focus on a few points highlighted in the outline that have caught my mind. So, like him, I won't bring too many answers to the questions we can raise, of course, but just to have clear minds on all those very complex and globalized issues. My first point would be to frame it like that: the rise of geoeconomics in global issues. That is a shift of balance of power from the political ground to the economic ground, parallel to the weaponization of major economic and digital issues and stakes. And here is the COVID-19 has highlighted some pre-existing trends. A global tech interdependence, which is still actual, but countered, as we all know, by the US and China, and the issue of diversifying supply chains. So in that regard, Donald Trump's actions may be extreme, having other issues, of course, but he has recognized that in the 21st century, national sovereignty no longer means the possession of an independent defense industry. And today, countries' economic fortunes are increasingly dominated by large technology groups, as we mentioned earlier, and which means that global influence is just as much about computing power and control of the relevant intellectual property. So this is a shift, actually, that we must all comprehend. And this new world of technological sovereignty now fully blends the industrial and the geopolitical issues. China is pursuing its tech sufficiency effort and adjustment in chips, especially AI chips, while the US seeks to reshape those global tech supply chains we have dealt with in the past conference, as well as they try to reinforce their control over critical components for their cyber weapons. So, and if we see the recent deal between NVIDIA and ARM, we are pretty much into this reshaping of the supply chains with a clear national security component. My second point, and I'll be quick, it's it might seem commonplace, but it's the interaction, the nature of the interaction between tech companies and governments, which is not a new issue, of course, but with the COVID-19, the issue has taken a much more strategic importance. And as of 2020, actually today, the power which has been accumulated by the US big tech, to be quick, makes it hard to control those private actors for multiple set of factors. I will not go into details, of course, but today the GAFAM, as we call it, for example in France or in Brussels, they compete today with state diplomacy without nonetheless accepting the responsibilities for exerting state diplomacy. And it's interesting to go back 10 years ago. Yeah, my mic. It's interesting to go back 10 years ago because in the early 2010, the eruption of actors like Google or Facebook, for example, on the international arena already seemed irreversible, and 10 years later, the datafication of the world seems totally commonplace and largely escapes from government control. So the actor now try to leverage their own power in a way that was not the case actually 10 years ago. They are not traditional players, of course. They remain inseparable from the exercise of US power, of course. That power is global, it's diffuse. Those players are no longer just digital giants, as we long called them. Their sphere of interest concern many domain and issues, from education, employment, and so on, which is a clear sovereignty actually issue for many countries today. My third point, which is much more topical, because I think when we deal with such issues, we have to anticipate the outcome of the US election, because given the weight of the US in the global tech politics and industries. And here we have to anticipate the Trump re-elections, and it's likely issues this morning. The first would be the consequences of increasing US-China tensions upon Europe. We would probably see the continuation of the undermining of multilateralism, the erosion of traditional liberal democratic values, to be quick once again. And here, what's interesting is that with Donald Trump presidency, the moral leadership of the US in the digital realm has waned. And this may be a euphemism, of course. And 10 days earlier, once again, Hillary Clinton's 2010 speech on internet freedom seems far away. And in 2020, today, the US no longer embody actually freedom of the internet. And this has clear strategic implication, political strategic implications for many countries, including for Western allies of the United States. So this is something we have also to keep, perhaps to keep in mind and to think about in a more substantial way. My last point, and I stop here, is under the implication of a Trump re-election. It would be the pursuit of the US exceptionalism policy, regardless of any diplomatic cost. Here I'm thinking about the initiative pushed by Mike Pompeo with regard to the Clean Network program, because this program seeks to prevent any foreign adversaries from accessing US systems through companies such as Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and so on. And this is a new policy which claims to safeguard US citizens' privacy, but which is in some way based on double standards, of course, when we think to the disclosures by students 7 years ago. So once again, this is something we have to think about in a more structured way. And my final point is in relation to the sort of decoupling activity pushed by the US. Pushed by US firms with China, and this is also one issue we could perhaps discuss in more length, because this has clear implications for European countries which talk more and more about strategic autonomy, about tech sovereignty, and so on. But I think we are in a very early phase, actually, of such policy-related debates on tech sovereignty. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Julien. Lots to think about there. I'm very pleased that you mentioned AI chips, because can you have a discussion about tech sovereignty and about the future without talking about AI and the rise of quantum and things? I don't think you can. So I'm glad we've got them out there nice and early. Brilliant. Kieran, let's come to you for a little bit of competition and antitrust perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francis. Let me raise a hypothesis, pose a question, and identify what I see as a key problem. The hypothesis is that to this particular onion of a subject, there's a core issue of security, but layered around it, there are elements of economics and politics, law and society, which have created complexity and confusion. And the main question I would ask is, assuming the legitimacy of the core security issue, how should we address these additional layers? The key problem I see is that there's no single forum, no accepted method to objectively examine the various layers and to identify the cost-benefit outcomes to society of accepting or rejecting the consequences of these various layers. So a further speculative question that seems to be the theme today. The speculative question, in my view, is whether the government measures that are in place or that are proposed to be put in place could be an example of regulatory failure. Namely, when public policy action appeared justified, but fails to solve the problem satisfactorily or helps create new problems. And I wanted to give an example, but a historic one to give some perspective. So this is, I think, an imperfect historic example, but there is trade tension at the moment between the United States and China, and it's reminiscent, in my view, of the trade tensions that arose between the United States and Japan in the 1970s and the 1980s. This trade issue grew and became a political hot potato, such that in the 1984 presidential election between the Republican candidate Ronald Reagan and the Democratic candidate Walter Mondale, Walter Mondale famously asked of President Ronald Reagan, what do we want our kids to do? Sweep up around the Japanese computers. Japan is and was an ally of the US and entered into so-called voluntary export restraints, one of which related to the cars. The National Bureau of Economic Research, many years after the event, has undertaken a study and looked at the consequences of this voluntary limit on the number of Japanese cars being exported to the US. And the consequences were that the price of Japanese cars in the US rose by 14%. The price of cars generally in the United States over the main period of 1974 to 1984 rose by 5.7% each year, even though the historic average over the last 50 years is about 1.7%. And the import of cars from South Korea increased materially. So on a sort of a net basis, the National Bureau of Economic Research determined that the cost to US society as a whole in terms of dollars was roughly $3 billion, and that's in 1984. So that's a lot of money. So this is just an example of the consequences of perhaps overaction or inappropriate action, which I think earlier David was perhaps pointing to. So in that context, I think that one of the challenges we see with those measures where suppliers are being prohibited or limited as regards entering or active on the market, I think that the antitrust outcomes of those are almost self-evident by reducing the number of suppliers, indeed significant suppliers. The potential consequences are negative, and that a review of the situation with an antitrust hat would seem to me to be appropriate. In that vein, as perhaps you know, the EU is contemplating adopting powers to pursue a market investigation type of procedure, which would potentially give them the ability to impose ex ante measures. In other words, measures anticipating problems. So my proposal, if you will, not that it's me formally to propose, is that this is something that should seriously be considered by authorities really around the world as regards the challenges that I see in the antitrust space. Thank you.
Brilliant, Kieran. Thank you so much. And it's very interesting that you raised the question of like who's going to be the judge, who's going to arbitrate this, where do we turn to for a kind of fair decision on this? Because certainly something that I was covering a few years ago, there's a kind of ongoing rumblings between Apple and Samsung, and just a sort of different number of different courts all over the world who all weighed in. It's like, well, who's going to win this week? It was a real soap opera. Brilliant. So we need to think about the ecosystem of the internet, about the forest, and the man who knows all about that is Konstantinos. So why don't you tell us about your thoughts on this? Sorry, Konstantinos.
Thank you, Francis, and good morning, everyone. My name is Konstantinos Komaitis, and I work for an organization called the Internet Society. We are a global organization working towards an open, secure, trustworthy, and global internet. And I am here to talk about the internet and why, under the current climate at least, we believe that an impact assessment analysis is required, perhaps now more than ever. And when I talk about the internet, I don't really mean the services that we all use every day or the things that the news cover every day. I mean, first and foremost, the internet as a collection of independent networks that connect to one another through a voluntary set of open standards that ensure interoperability. And the main reason that I'm focusing on this particular aspect of the internet is because changes to this layer, intended or unintended, can have a profound effect. And I'm not sure, I don't think, better yet, that we are thinking of this effect that it can have to the way those networks interconnect. So I would like to make a couple observations that would hopefully get some reactions, and they're not very much different from what the previous speaker have said. I think that we can all agree that currently anything global is under extreme duress. The global financial system, the global security system, the global health system, the global environmental regime. And the internet is in the middle of this pressure by virtue of having as one of its main objectives this idea of global reach. The second observation is how the internet is used and the effects of that use. So, on the one hand, we have issues like disinformation, antitrust, extremist content, etc., that are proliferating, and they are in eager need for to be addressed. And on the other hand, we have COVID-19 and the internet's demonstrable resilience. And if you think about it, the internet was really prepared for COVID-19. Governments, not so much. Tackling the first while ensuring that the internet maintains its resilience and agility is one of the biggest challenges, and one that will determine the kind of the internet we actually have tomorrow. Now, the current approach to all these things is a mixed bag of potentially dangerous trends. So what do we see? We see state actors interfering, we see some state actors, better yet, interfering with the internet, attempting to score short-term political points without regard to the long-term damage that results. Examples include, and we've just heard it, the US Clean Act initiative, attempts to ban WeChat and TikTok and things like that. We also see an attempt to address societal problems via technical fixes, and we know that this rarely works. For instance, this whole idea of upload filters in order to deal with objectionable and illegal content poses some very serious questions. We also see a great difficulty in addressing effectively the apparent market failure, the competition discussions that Kieran just very, very clearly alluded to. And then, last but not least, we are also seeing emerging technology and security concerns often being used as a justification for proposals that could ultimately undermine the internet. And I'm talking about the new IP proposal that currently is before the ITU. So what is there to do? At the Internet Society, we believe that a good starting point to understand and address some of these issues, at least, is through an impact assessment analysis, which is similar to the one that we do in the context of the environment. So environmental regulation often conducts an impact assessment in order to understand what the impacts of that regulation will be on the environment. A regulatory impact assessment constitutes a tool that ensures a regulation is proportional, it is targeted, it is predictable, accountable, and transparent. So to this effect, we have created a toolkit that aims to help policymakers and technologists to make informed choices. And what it does is that it identifies a set of critical properties we believe are crucial for the Internet to continue to evolve. If we don't start doing this now, I believe that we're in danger of losing the Internet, at least the way we know it and we use it. So I will stop here, and I am happy to talk about any of this, of course, in more detail. Thank you.
Just an absolute nightmare. Brilliant. Wayne-Yan, why don't you tell us a bit more about your research at SETS? And I understand you've got some slides to share with us, which should ping up via the magic of technology. Hopefully you can all see those. Wayne-Yan, go for it.
Thank you very much, Francis. Good morning. I'm very privileged to join you all to discuss the issues of digital infrastructure, technology, and cybersecurity. And those important issues are actually multifaceted issues, encompassing not just national security, but also technology and a few trade disciplines such as market access, national treatment. And I have a feeling that these days the discussions on these issues are overwhelmed by national security, that everything has become very geopolitical and rhetorical. But I think security breach is always a risk that we must stay vigilant, and even among NATO, Europe allies, that security breach can be there. But on the other hand, if we look at technology to see where we are, and we will see a different picture, I would like to show you some slides that from the data of WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization. From their latest Global Innovation Index, among the EU 28, 6 of them are in the world top 10 most innovative economies. And the US is number 3, and China is number 14. However, we must see that China is catching up very fast. According to Eurostats, China is catching up at 3 times the EU's innovation performance growth rate. Next slide, please. And we will see, next slide, please. The geography of scientific knowledge and innovation activities, there is a trend that they become global, but at the same time very local, concentrating a few spots. And next slide, please. Innovation activities on patent applications. So I use this PCT as a reference, a patent system administered by the WIPO. And for the first time in 2019, that China overtook the US as the biggest patent applicant under PCT. For the last 4 decades, US was number 1. And next slide, please. And Huawei is the top PCT applicant firm. And in fact, for the last 3 years, Huawei is the number 1 firm global-wise on PCT applications. However, next slide, please. We cannot say which country really dominates digital technology or computer technology. As there is a competition among these countries. In fact, China, US, Japan, Korea, and Germany their patent offices are the world's biggest patent offices in the world. So the innovation. So what I want to say is there is a fair amount of competition between them, and that will. I'm done with that slide. Thank you. And that will lead to my next point on trade. And we see that competition is good, but it's good as long as it is conducted with fair play. And we see that how US-China trade war was ignited, how those EU business grievances come from, actually come from China's outstanding WTO obligations that it has not fulfilled, and it must do in order to gain trust from its trading partners and also to basically fulfill its contractual obligations. For example, on forced technology transfer, it's actually not so much to do with technology, but on market access, on national treatment, and on freedom to contract, and how to uphold patent holders' exclusive rights to exploit his or her innovation. And to conclude, I would say that we need to keep vigilant, but at the same time, we need to cooperate and to compete, to complement each other's technology strengths. And I would like to finally quote English poet John Donne, who said that no man is an island, every man is a piece of the continent. So to avoid balkanization, we do need cooperation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Rainy Ann. And a bit of poetry on a Friday morning. Just that's a lovely thing to bring to the table. Great. So we've heard a lot about China. So it'd be very interesting. I mean, you're there right now, Shen. Why don't you tell us about your perspective on the discussion? Oh, can we hear you?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
It's okay.
perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Perfect.
Francis. My great pleasure to participate in this debate and to join this salon. I'm a professor of international relations in the School of International Relations and Public Affairs in Fudan Universities, and my research focuses on the cybersecurity in the aspect of international relations, especially focusing on the Sino-US relationship on cybersecurity and the governance of global cyberspace. To today's topic, I want to say 3 points. The first, generally speaking, with the development of this ICT, we enter into the new phase of this ICT revolution. We can name it digitalizations. After informationizations, the network and now the data become the core center of all these governance issues. All actors, including state actors and the non-state actors, pay more and more attention on the importance of this data, especially the proper use of this data, because of it has very important meanings in national security, development of economy, and the protection of personal information and privacy protection and so on. And in this aspect, we have to admit, first, there is a reasonable concern on the proper use of this data or the governance of internet and so on. And all these things, second, can finding a proper balance between or among different requirements, among different actors, if you take a quite practical attitude. And the third, it's very necessary to launch or push forward to get new international understandings, to improve, to launch new initiations in the system levels so that we have a more proper global governance structures to ensure all these requirements from different actors. And the second, the main challenge, I think lots of mentioned the Sino-US relationships, the development of China, and those security concerns on China's side. I have to say all these concerns, especially the national security concern from the United States toward China, can be separated into two parts. The first part is those consolidate reasonable concern, which can be finding appropriate technical solutions. The second is a kind of misperception of national concern, which cannot be properly resolved by practical technical means. Now, the main challenge is not, I think, lying in the technical aspect. It's more in the perception aspect. And the critical or the most important question is whether what kind of future orders we want to have, to which extent we can get kind of better understanding on these things and find out more practical solutions to find out how to say a path to solve all these challenges we face today. Third, the point from China's side, according to my understanding, I think our Foreign Minister Wang Yi deliver a remark in Paris just in this a few months ago. He said that nowadays the so-called competition between China and the United States is not a kind of competition for power transition. It's not a competition between different ideological issues. It's not a competition focusing on so-called their positions in the world. But the real difference is whether we should take a kind of hegemonic method to solve the problems, a more cooperative method, a multilateral method to solve these problems. I think China has its willingness to finding out common solutions so that we can fulfill three different requirements. The first, to fulfill all these necessary national security concerns raised by the state actors in the governance of global cyberspace. We wish to respect the equity of cyber sovereignties in the global cyberspace. These principles can provide an important basement for future cooperations. And the second, we need to consider that such kind of solutions must consider the balance among the different interests among the different actors. We need to, and it's possible to find such kind of solution. If we use the TikTok issues in the United States as a kind of examples, even the TikTok cases in some period that the TikTok and Oracle, they got a draft solution, then they can use the Oracle servers to localize salvage their US user data in that servers so that it can release the national security concern. It's quite practical issues to solve all these things. And the last, of course, not the least, the so-called balkanization of the internet is very important concern. But it's not kind of a result that cannot be avoided if we have enough courage to finding more creative initiations to launch cooperation based on multilateral, multi-party participants, not only so-called the multi-stakeholder models, but those multi-party participant models, and can respect the state actors and treat the state actors and the non-state actors in quite equal ways. It's still possible to find cooperative solutions to solve all these challenges that threaten the integrity of the global cyberspace today. Okay, that's my point. Thank you.
Brilliant, Shen. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. It's a really good set of remarks. And I think we've got a lot of things to talk about. It seems to me that everybody agrees that there is a problem. There's a growing problem. And I think we've come up with basically a number of tools that could be used to fix it. Now, I know as a moderator, should only have 3 points. I'm going to go mad because I think there are 7 that have come out. First of all, antitrust tools. Kieran brought that to the table. Lovely. Second, existing diplomatic tools. That's something that David, Julian and Shen all touched on, the kind of structures that we have right now. Thirdly, a kind of future new international solution, because just as the internet has revolutionized the way we live and work, perhaps, we need a kind of, I don't know, new Bretton Woods sounds very grand, but there are kind of hints that we could have a new forum to resolve these things. Then Wayne Yan discussed the use of kind of IP and patent law and rules that we have that can play into the situation. Number 5, the free market of the internet that David mentioned, this kind of perhaps things will, spin up from the way that we conduct ourselves online, that could be a useful tool. Number 6, I was kind of called a trade business, like the way that Oracle, TikTok, that involved private companies coming together to come up with a solution. And then Konstantinos, I like it. He took a tool off the table. He was like, the answer is not a technical solution. The what will fix this current international impasse is not tinkering around in a bunch of server racks wherever they may be. So, we've got a lot of ideas there that we can maybe work through in this next set of questions. And it all comes back to this thing of, there is a problem. The problem is growing. How bad is it going to be? Are we looking at a little bump in the road and we're all going to recover and go on enjoying the internet, talking to each other in our new globalized world? Or is this potentially quite a big dip that it's going to take us a few years to come back from? So I guess all of that boils down to which tools are the best and how bad is it going to get? And David, I wondered if you wanted to come back in on that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, no, I think there is a real problem, and I think it's a serious problem, and it is a potentially toxic mix of real national security concerns and economic interest and competing economic interest. And trying to sort that out is going to be difficult. But I do believe that the only way forward is to have conversations between the most interested parties about how we kind of deal with these issues. I mean, I think Shen's point about there are technical solutions to the national security concerns. They will never be perfect, but I think there are ways of creating a greater sense of confidence, mutual confidence through some of these technical solutions. I think we have to be careful. I think there is an abuse of the national security motive at the present time, which is definitely something of which the Trump administration is guilty in the trade field as in the tech field. And I think that's a pity because it is blurring the frontier between the economic and the national security in a way that's most unhelpful. So I think we need to look at the national security issue. I think we need to look at some set of rules to try and deal with the issues which potentially will divide the internet. So wide differences on data protection, for example. And then we need to sort out some of the economic issues, which will be the classic kind of trade negotiation. But there are fora for doing that, whether it's the OECD or elsewhere. So I don't think there's a one-stop shop where you kind of solve all these problems in one place. I think you need to start it in different fora, and in some cases, the national security one, we may have to invent some new way of looking at it. But I think you need to address those broad three sets of issues. Otherwise, I think we are going to head for a very disruptive and difficult and confrontational moment across these issues.
Very much. And Julien, you're into the geopolitics of all this, and if I understand, you're even working on a book on this issue. So how bad do you think it's going to get? That's not a very nice way of putting it, but how bad? Oh, Julien, you need to unmute. We can't hear you.
Yes, sorry, Frances. Yeah, no. How bad are we? And will be. It's pretty much international relations, realistic theories, and so on. So it's quite funny in a way. But anyway, Ambassador Sullivan talked about a set of rules that we all should. Put forward and discuss between the main players and so on. Yes, of course we should. But seen from here, so from Western European countries, how do we do? How do we do in a context in which the US is not shy about practicing a sort of weaponization, as I mentioned earlier, of those tech issues. On the other way, we have other countries which are in a in a much more brutal way of exporting their own technologies with clear surveillance and non-democratic values as well. So I think the main challenge here is when we are living in Europe and thinking in sort of European interest. What should we put forward? I mean, on the one side, the regulation and taxation issues, or the much more political and strategic challenge of not being caught into this concrete US spat over tech issues. So I think we have to put the finger on the right, number one issue.
Perfect. Great. And it is interesting. I feel like the rhetoric, from Macron, from von der Leyen, has really ramped up recently in terms of what their language is increasingly blunt. And I do kind of wonder whether we're careering towards a good old-fashioned trade war, just playing out on new fronts with new tools.
Yeah.
So I guess it's interesting to think about, maybe we should bring the conversation back to Europe for a moment, because we have heard a lot about China and the US and the whole digital sovereignty approach. What could that mean in terms of market access for EU and, as they're charmingly called, non-Indigenous companies? I guess, Kieran, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, thanks, Francis. Let me sort of just segue from the previous point. I don't know if people sort of caught this, but I'm picking up what the two previous speakers talked about, the national security and the sort of where is the proper edge of that criterion. And just very briefly, I'll give you a quote from a report to the Senate committee in the Parliament in France. So the rapporteur recalls, however, that Huawei is not the only one equipment manufacturer on which suspicions may arise as to the nature of its links with a foreign state. It has been publicly established, contrary to what has happened so far in Huawei, that the United States has voluntarily implanted backdoors in the equipment of the American company Cisco so that its intelligence services could undermine the secrecy of correspondence as revealed by the Snowden affair. Similarly, the US authorities can rely on the Cloud Act, which allows law enforcement agencies to compel US service providers to provide data stored on services which are located in the United States or in foreign countries. I don't know the validity of any of those statements, but I just offer that quote. It's clearly something that the French have been thinking about. So if you play a national security or an EU digital sovereignty approach, the game may get played on a two-way track. My view as to the digital sovereignty, just briefly, as you raised the question of me, and let me try and respond, is we are facing a competition issue. And the argument, I think, is simple. By limiting a major player, or potentially more, because it's not just Huawei, from the EU market, the natural consequence is a lowering of competition that can lead to higher prices, lower quality. If one adds, the single fact that Huawei was generally regarded as one of the lower cost suppliers, competition outcomes don't seem to be positive. So I sort of repeat myself that I think an investigation is sort of merited. And the sovereignty point, I think that it's really important to clarify this word security, because if it's national security, then I think we would all agree every sovereign state needs to ensure that its infrastructure, etc., and critical services have a high level of protection. But there's a lot when people talk about security of the citizen and the citizen's data. And I just sort of raise 2 points, 2 questions. The first is, and it's been brought out before, but does an EU citizen really care or understand about whether its data is being gathered by TikTok or Amazon? I mean, is that really a big difference? And secondly, is Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, unmoved if a foreign secret service were listening in on her mobile calls? I think we can judge the answer to that by her reaction to it being revealed that the US Secret Service was in fact listening on her mobile calls. I don't know whether the US Secret Service were using any Chinese-made products. That's an open point. But what I do by raising those 2 points is national security, critical structure. Yes, I understand. And there's a line that can be drawn. It ought to be drawn properly. I think the debate about, let's call it security of the citizen, That's a much more fuzzy debate to have, and I'm personally not convinced that citizens have demonstrated a high degree of concern about the nationality of the corporations that are
And I
gathering
love
their
it.
data.
Put the cat among the pigeons there. That's great. But it is a two-way street. Exactly. There's a lot of finger pointing, but also a lot of people doing things in their own backyard. Konstantinos, can I bring you in on digital sovereignty, seeing as we're here?
Thanks, Francis. Yes, and I'll be brief, and I will take it a little bit outside the national security context, not because it's not very important, but because there is this other consideration that we don't tend to speak about or think when we're talking about sovereignty, and that is, again, the impact that it will have on the internet and the networks. Because the tricky thing about sovereignty is that by the time you legitimize it as a part of the conversation, you're sort of, we have heard from Europe that European values should be integrated within the internet. You cannot really do that, right? By the time you legitimize internet sovereignty within the context of the internet, then anybody's values is as valid as yours. So I think that we need to have a very good conversation about what we mean by sovereignty, especially within the context of the internet, because what we're currently saying is that we are at a place where we're seeing the rise of new networks, we are seeing the rise of massive companies, and we're seeing the rise of new policies or politics in the context of the internet, and all that puts pressure on the infrastructure of the internet, and it can lead actually to fragmentation and balkanization and all those things that you've mentioned before. And I would like to bring in here the consideration. There is this great political scientist and anthropologist called James Scott, and he wrote this book, which I think is fascinating, calling it Seeing It Like a State. And the point that he makes there is that states have the tendency to intervene within complex systems and try to create legible structures out of them. And in an effort to do that, they essentially they discount local knowledge and the intricacies of the complexity. And the result is chaos. So we really need to understand that the internet is a complex system. And if we are to have those conversations, and I think that Ambassador O'Sullivan mentioned that, we need to bring in everyone. We need to have collaboration is key in this aspect if we need to address those very complex issues.
There's a very good point about states and structures. And David said back in his opening remarks that China has shown you can kind of effectively control the internet. So I guess there's a few points there that to get a Chinese perspective, it might be good to come to you, Shen, for your thoughts on that.
The regulation of internet is always part of policies which was very difficult to describe, or it's tough things to discuss. So because of several reasons. First, I think the China concern that the development of the internet should not raise a threat to national security in quite general ways. Especially, internet should not become a kind of tools to launch kind of a threat to the domestic political procedures. I think in quite a long times, at least before the year 2016, non-European countries and the United States accept these ideas, or they believe that internet should be treated kind of free tools to deliver these informations until US and EU, their domestic political procedures face the same threat, the same kind of category threat, and then they launch nearly the same reactions in certain ways. Of course, there's quite different options and different behaviors. And the second, I think it's also related to these sovereignty things. When we're talking about the sovereignty in the global cyberspace, we do not mean that we use the sovereignty to cut off the internet. The really reasons we're talking about these sovereignties is first, the technical distribution among different state actors is different, which means some is strong, some is weak. And the weak countries will also want to have their legal reasons to defend their core interest. And the second, when they're talking about this sovereignty, especially from China's side, we want to respect the equality of sovereignty in the global cyberspace. We wish such kind of respect can providing an equal basement for any international corporations, so that those relatively weak states should not concern that entering such kind of corporations will threat or challenge their core interest. So when we talk about the sovereignty in the global cyberspace, the main reason, the main purpose is to launch a more effective cooperations. It's not about isolations. And the last, those sovereignty things providing a basement for the state as kind of relatively independent actors to participate more actively in global governance procedures. Because in quite a long times, the US version of multi-stakeholder models, I mean the US version, the United States explanation of these multi-stakeholder models, it refers that the only state actors in these multi-stakeholder models is US government. No single other countries can enter in such kind of multi-stakeholder model procedures. That raises concern because it's worried that the US will abuse its advantages in the global cyberspace. So from China's side, we want to find a balance between the development of the internet, the national security, and the economic prosperities, not only in the domestic, but also globally.
Brilliant. And then just before we come to some questions from the floor, Wei-Nian, I'd love to bring you in on these points just made about finding this balance. How do you see that affecting innovation sort of globally, drawing on your research? Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
I think I want to separate technology and national security. As I said just now, national security is always, security breach is always a risk, as Kiran also gave very precise examples. But on the other hand, on technology, that's actually a private law issue. Innovation, patent law, IPR law, those are actually private law issues. For that, I'm actually a bit puzzled by EU's so-called digital sovereignty, because I see that they put a digital innovation private law and with sovereignty, which is a public law issue. And on the other hand, I want to say a bit, as I also mentioned just now, on other trade disciplines, a major suspicion for the EU businesses and for the US is on China's SOEs. And because very practically, people are worried that one day the whole Europe, all those critical infrastructures, not just about internet infrastructure, but also about ports, harbors, they are actually will be all in the hands of China's Communist Party because of SOE's involvement. They are basically, they act like a regulator, investor, and operator. And for that, I think this concern is very legitimate as well. There are Ericsson. Ericsson is also a company, but it's in China too. But Huawei and other infrastructure companies, people are really worried that one of these days, the whole critical infrastructure in Europe or in the US will be bought by the SOE by China. I think that's something really in the back of people's mind. And that's why we say about the sovereignty, about strategic autonomy. I think that's the concern. Thank you.
Brilliant. Very, very quickly before we move on to questions on the floor, Kiran, Konstantinos, given that we've kind of come back to the structure of the internet, is there anything you want to add?
I think that, you know, the only thing that I want to add is that we're taking the internet for granted here, and we really should not take for granted the infrastructure of the internet. Yes, it has proven its resilience and it has proven its agility, especially in times of a pandemic like COVID, but we are exercising a lot of pressure currently on that infrastructure, and at some point there is a possibility that, you know, the internet itself cannot withstand this pressure. So we need to trade a little bit carefully, and we need to be very mindful of those critical properties that constitute the essence of the internet.
Brilliant. So I've got some questions from the floor. We've also got 7 minutes of our official time left. And, you know, I hate panels that overrun. I hated it when I was a journalist, and I'm not a fan now. So we should try and tackle a few of these questions that have come in, and maybe I might let overrun a tiny bit, but not a lot. So I've got a question from Octavian Prospecu, I hope I've pronounced that right, at Yukon Reg about cyber attacks. Do you see a solution to the problem of growing cyber attacks against critical infrastructure? Which binds in quite nicely with an anonymous question saying, on security, what responsibilities do tech companies have for providing greater trust, or are they in a bind because of geopolitics? So we come back to this kind of question of who is ultimately responsible for this too. We have a situation where private companies are kind of being set up as proxies. Countries are applying rules in a slightly unprecedented and forceful way. And I like Kieran's point that the consumer at the end of the day has opted out of this. They're like, can I buy stuff online? Will it come to my house quickly? Don't really care who I'm sharing my data with. So in terms of cyber attacks and where responsibility lies, I guess, Julien, you're Mr. Geopolitics, so we'll come to you very quickly.
Thank you, Francis. Yeah, all those questions are fascinating, and actually, we will need 1 hour, 1 hour more to tackle a part of the answer. So I'll try to make it in some 30 seconds. If I see any solutions to these issues of cyber attacks multiplying, well, actually, we are in a context in which those cyber attacks today are multiplying and are getting much more sophisticated. With the COVID-19, we saw much more ransomware tactics used by hackers and non-state or state actors. And we have still no consensus on a global level related to the way states should conduct with regard to those threats. So within the UN, we have the GGE, the group of government experts, which have been gathering for the past 15 years, but with no real foray in terms of common norms and standards. And more recently, we have the OEWG, the open-ended working group, but with the upper hand of Russia, it seems. So we're still in a context in which the main international players are struggling to keep the upper hand and trying to enforce their own vision of what is cyberspace and how states should conduct in that domain. So I don't have any solutions now to bring. I'm sorry. And in that geopolitics, the tech players, as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, are actors. Actually, it's what I said. I think those players are not really are not disconnected from this sphere and are part of that complex geopolitics. And today, Facebook, for example, or Microsoft, again more in cybersecurity, are stakeholders actually. So states today cannot but interact with those players, which raise many issues, as I mentioned as well earlier.
Great, and it's nice that you've brought the UN in. I've actually got a couple of questions from the floor pinging up, one of which says anonymously and quite bluntly, the UN is failing. How do we get a moderate approach and international norms to work out? And then I get another one saying, what role should the UN play? The existing, but why create a new body when we have an existing one? So I guess, David, you're the person with the most experience of these organizations. I'm just going to put you on the spot and say, what about the UN?
I'm not sure. I think the analogy I would go back to is nuclear deterrence and the nuclear disarmament. I think the cybersecurity and the national security analogy, that's the one that best fits. So I'm not sure that there is an existing body, in my view, that would be capable of handling this kind of discussion. I'm not opposed to it, but I think it needs a new initiative, and I would suggest some kind of fresh conference where the key players sit round and try to figure out how you deal with this, bearing in mind, as was just said, that we're not just talking about cyber warfare between states, but also non-state actors. And we, the states have an interest also in cooperating in making that less feasible, or in finding ways of counteracting it. So I think this needs a new international initiative, which really sits down, gets key people, and says, how do we go about creating a minimum set of rules? It will not be perfect any more than the nuclear disarmament talks were ever perfect, but at least if you get people around the table discussing, you have less chance.
Very good point. Work with the world you have, not with the world you want. I was going to come to Shen, but he appears to have disappeared. Shen, you there? But instead, Konstantinos, I'd love to know your thoughts about the UN.
I think that the UN certainly has a role to play. I don't think that it is just the UN that needs to play that role. And the internet has historically been based on this whole idea of multi-stakeholder participation, and it's mainly about collaboration, right? It is mainly about people coming together and discussing. The internet is an outcome of collaboration that included also governments. It was not just a bunch of private actors or academia that did create the internet. So I think that to the extent that we can, that the UN can facilitate such collaboration, it really doesn't matter where it happens, as long as that collaboration happens. And currently, unfortunately, a lot of the processes of the UN do not make room for this inclusivity that is very much necessary for to address those internet issues.
Brilliant. And Shen, you're back. I hope you didn't miss too much of the discussion, because I wanted you to bring you in on the UN and multilateral ways of working.
To United Nations, I think till now it's the only multilateral platforms globally to providing the legitimacy for the state actors to take actions. And I think United States, the real challenge is how to develop effective mechanisms to working on these issues, to find the practical solutions that fulfill the requirement in the global levels. You should not ask the UN to solve very detailed or regional level questions. But globally, when we're talking about the global governance issues, the order, then talking about the new orders or the improvement of the global cyberspace governance in quite a general ways, I think United Nations also is still maybe the best platforms. Of course, I know that according to the multi-stakeholder models, the ISOC, all these ISTAT institutions is very important. But the real challenge is, till now, even we taking into account all these international companies, the state actors is also only maybe one of the most important actors to talking about global cyberspace governance, especially on this governance related to policy decision-making procedures. And if we want to go to the state acts in and the UN, you should not neglect or underestimate its importance. Of course, UN has a lot of trouble and problems, but we need to find mechanisms to solve these things. That's my thinking about these UN issues. And one more sentence on this SOE, the state-owned enterprise. You should not overestimate the capacity of the so-called the control of the government on the so-called SOE things. And actually, a lot of perceptions need to, reshaped or recorrect before we talk in future about the finding possible solutions on these global cyberspace governance things in general ways. Yes.
Perfect. Wei-Nian, let me bring you in on the subject too.
Thank you very much, Francis. I would like to say on UN's function in this regard, I believe the UN has a code of conduct for state-to-state surveillances, but not on private companies. In any case, private companies, that's private actors, that's not for UN to regulate. And I think for private companies, the trade bodies should have a draft kind of a code of conduct. But on the other hand, very importantly, it's contractual obligations that people must comply with. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Great. Perfect. So I guess to wrap things up, because it's always nice to finish nearly on time, I might come to Kieran, because we haven't heard from you in a while, and you've written a report on Huawei and Europe, which for those of you who want a little further reading, there's Konstantinos' toolkit we've seen come across the bottom, and there's this report on Huawei and possible antitrust issues. And so really, in doing that, you have to come up with executive summaries for things. So perhaps you could executively summarize the debate here and maybe have a little gaze into your crystal ball in terms of what you think happened.
Okay, thanks very much, Francis. Well, as regards to the report, which is available online, it's been published by Huawei. It's not as dramatic in terms of the recommendations as I see it, as one might imagine, and yet we encourage a deeper review of the situation. I think there's not been enough work done, although there's a lot of words. If anyone's read the Solarium Commission's report, that's a lot of words. But I'm not sure how deep the analysis has really occurred in relation to many of the aspects which have been discussed today. I've talked about an antitrust investigation. I think that's a very kind of distinct approach that can be looked at, certainly from an EU perspective, to protect what otherwise might be foreseen or unforeseen consequences of these government measures. I think I would encourage the EU to kind of do a mini test of the Cybersecurity Act, maybe apply it in some pro-temp way to 5G network technologies, because I think that that would help to distinguish between the technical issues and technical solutions and the more political side of the mix, which I think we've all agreed is a mix which is unhelpful to it all. So those are the three recommendations. It's really think about it more. Don't take precipitative early actions. I think on the overall elements of the UN and a couple of other points you touched, Francis, my view, I think the UN probably is the right forum. We can see that through the WHO, it's been able to address many challenges of a public and private nature, for example, in the Tobacco Convention, which I think is a nice way of thinking about how the United Nations might eventually get to a place where member states can agree, but it has important consequences for private actors. I think in terms of cybersecurity attacks, I'm a bit aggressive there. I think private participants should take care of themselves, just like you can have a lock on your front door of your house or not, it's up to you. But I think obviously care and attention needs to be paid for the public sector and for critical aspects. I'll finish there.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you who tuned in for the questions. You know, it's the first bit of moderating I've done online. I was like, what if we don't get any questions? But they've all pinged up, so that's great. Keep the conversation going on Twitter and at the Cybersecurity Summit, which you can all sign up for. The link's just coming along there below. And most of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our participants. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Really appreciate it. And I've enjoyed this discussion a lot. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.